How to create an EFI system partition? TL, Doctor, how do I create an EFI system partition from scratch? How do I put the EFI firmware on it once it is created? Long version. I have a Toshiba T430 laptop. I received it with Windows 7 installed, but I think originally it has shipped with Windows 8. I installed Ubuntu on it, but deleted some partitions on the disk so that I ended up wiping out the Windows and only having Ubuntu. Among the deleted partitions was the EFI System Partition. I discovered that Ubuntu now boots in legacy mode and not UEFI. I am trying to follow this guide on converting my Ubuntu installation from legacy to UEFI. The problem, since there is no EFI partition whenever I choose from BIOS to boot using UEFI, I cannot boot. That counts not only for the hard drive, but USB and DVD as well. I think this is logical. It expects an EFI partition, and since it can't find it, it cannot continue booting further, be it from HDD or DVD. So how do I recreate the EFI partition? The guide above says. Creating an EFI partition. If you are manually partitioning your disk in the Ubuntu installer, you need to make sure you have an EFI partition set up. If your disk already contains an EFI partition, e.g. if your computer had Windows 8 pre-installed, it can be used for Ubuntu too. Do not format it. It is strongly recommended to have only one EFI partition per disk. An EFI partition can be created via a recent version of Parted. The Parted version included in the 12.0.4 disk is OK, and must have the following attributes. Mount point /boot/EFI. Remark, no need to set this mount point when using the manual partitioning. The Ubuntu installer will detect it automatically. Size, minimum 100 MB. 200 MB recommended. Type, FAT32. Other, needs a boot flag. I had some trouble creating this partition. I boot from a live Ubuntu DVD, open Parted, create a 200 MB partition, and format it to FAT32. In Parted I cannot set the mount point and thus cannot set the boot flag. I didn't set the mount point in /etc/stab since it's a live CD, and stab look quite differently from what I expected compared to a normal boot. Anyway, I just didn't know what values to set. I booted again via the live DVD and then chose to install Ubuntu. I then created a partition with the mentioned criteria: mount point, 200 MB, FAT32, boot flag. However, I continue to have this problem, and I suppose it's because on that partition, there is no EFI firmware. It's just an empty partition, which is suitable to have EFI firmware. So again, how do I create an EFI partition, which has the EFI software, so that the laptop can once again boot in UEFI mode? Solution: thank you both for the answers. What I did was install Windows 8.1 from scratch by formatting the whole disk, and then installing, this time properly, Ubuntu next to it. These are my partitions now. During the Win 8 setup, as soon as I deleted all existing partitions and let Windows reformat the disk, it automatically created, besides the main install partition, 3 additional partitions, namely 1, 2, 3. Now, after I had a proper ESP, I could boot both from HDD or DVD in UEFI mode. You say that the ESP doesn't store any info by default, but I guess that when an OS installs, it puts some info there. So I guess my case was the following. I had wiped it out, and even though I recreated it, it was not filled with any info, since the creation of the ESP was done after an OS had been installed. I lost the Ubuntu installation, no big deal, it was a fresh install anyway, but I guess that in order to save it, I should have followed Groety's advice. Didn't have time, though, but happily everything is fine now.
First, you don't set the mount point in Parted, that's done manually, and temporarily, via the mount command or permanently by editing /etc/stab. Thus, your concern over this issue is misplaced. Second, an EFI System Partition, ESP, is simply a fat partition with a particular type code, namely, C12A7328F81F11D2BA4B00A0C93EC93B on GPT disks, set. Note that the mount point in /etc/stab is not part of the ESP's definition, it's just conventional, but not required, in Linux to access the ESP by mounting it at /boot/EFI, typically via an /etc/stab entry. How you set the type code varies from one program to another. In disk, you set the type code to FOO. Disk uses 2-byte type codes that expand out to the real type codes on the disk. FOO is just a mnemonic for C12A7328F81F11D2BA4B00A0C93EC93B. In Parted or Parted, you set the boot flag. Note, however, that this works only on GPT disks. You cannot set the ESP type code on MBR disks with these programs. This isn't normally a big deal, since EFI-based computers usually boot from GPT disks. In the Ubuntu installer, you identify the partition as an EFI boot partition. It then sets the type code and will set up /etc/stab appropriately. In recent versions of Linux disk, you set the partition type by its number, 1 for EFI system on GPT disks or 0s on MBR disks, or by entering the full type code on GPT disks. Third, the ESP does not hold firmware. Firmware is, by definition, stored in chips on the motherboard. Thus, your effort to install the EFI firmware on the ESP is a wild goose chase. There are two exceptions to this rule. First, you might store a firmware file on the ESP in order to update the firmware on your computer. This is just a temporary holding area, though. Second, the Duet or Clover bootloader. The EFI is loaded as a regular program, typically from the especially these tools are BIOS bootloaders, though, that enable BIOS-only computers to boot as if they were EFI machines. They are not normally used on computers with EFI firmware, which you claim your computer has. Technically, neither Duet nor Clover is firmware, they're BIOS bootloaders that do the same job as EFI. Finally, I can think of a number of possible causes for your problem, but without further information, I'd need to write half a book to cover them all. I recommend you run the boot info script on the computer. This will produce a file called results.txt. Post it to a pastebin site and post back with the URL to your document. That will give hard data on your configuration, which will greatly reduce the range of possible causes of your problem.
The EFI partition doesn't keep firmware, which is stored in a chip on the motherboard. It keeps the bootloaders for installed operating systems. It is basically the EFI alternative of putting the bootloader in the 0th sector of your disk, as was the case with BIOS pieces. This means that once you have such a partition, it should get filled automatically when you install the operating system. Quite likely though that the install disk itself must be booted in EFI mode, too, otherwise it won't bother setting up UEFI boot. In fact, certain parts of the setup can't even be done from BIOS mode. If you already have Ubuntu installed, you'll need to. Install the UEFI version of Grub. I think it is in the Grub EFI AM64 signed package. For the unsigned Grub EFI AM64 version, it's x86_64 EFI. Ensure that Grub has installed itself as /EFI/boot/boot64.EFI in the EFI System Partition. I'm using the EFI path syntax here. If you mount the partition at /boot on Linux, it would be /boot/EFI/boot/boot64.EFI. If it hasn't, copy grub64.EFI manually to that location. This is necessary because grub install cannot add itself to the EFI boot menu unless the system has already booted in EFI mode. The EFI variables are impossible to access in BIOS mode, therefore the only way to boot grub is by putting it at the fallback bootloader location. Reboot. Try to select some kind of EFI mode in your firmware's boot menu. EFI firmwares have a boot menu of their own, even before grub. Check if meg grep EFI column shows anything to confirm that you're in EFI mode.
Create 2 files with Notepad and save them to your USB Windows install drive. Save as create partitions UEFI.txt. Create another text file with Notepad. Save as discard UEFI.txt. If you are using MBR, the command will be convert MBR. To get the size of the Windows partition, multiply your HG size times 1024, a 100 gig hard drive times 1024 equals 102,400 minus 210, EFI size, minus 16. MSR size, minus 460, reserve size, equals the size you will put in the Windows partition size. XXXXXX. You can change the partition size from the terminal, command prompt cd/dd, and gt, Notepad create partitions UEFI.txt. While you are in the USB drive, open with Notepad discard UEFI.txt and leave open or write the command down so you will not make a mistake. Once you have changed the size of the partitions to your liking, close it, then cd/dx:/sources, then run the discard/sd:\create partitions UEFI.txt. List volume as the last command shows you the partitions, if happy. Exit and gt, turn off computer and gt, restart and gt, install.
If you want to support the channel, please consider subscribing.